Hi guys, my name is Jake Cusick, and for my persuasive speech, I'll be talking about how hunting is actually good for conservation. Some of the reasons I'm going to talk about is what happens when hunting is banned. Hunting was actually banned in Kenya in 1977. It's a great example of what happens um, when the hunting stops. What happens to the wildlife and what happens to the economy, really. Also some examples of where hunting is thriving now in Zambia and also in South Africa. I'm going to start talking about one of my friends I met while I was in Africa. His name's Chris. He was my guide. He is from Kenya, born and raised in Kenya. He was educated in England. He's probably in his 40s, maybe his 50s. I spent, over the last year, probably about a month and a half with Chris every day, so I got to know him pretty well. Chris was born, obviously, before hunting was banned in Kenya, and lived through most of his adult life without hunting. However, he was still around for quite a while hunting was still taking place. Throughout time, he told me how, even from his perspective, how easy it was for him to tell that the wildlife was declining. He was seeing less and less wildlife after the ban, and eventually it forced him to leave Kenya and go to Tanzania to be a guide, hunting guide. He still lives in Kenya. His family still lives in Kenya, and during the off season, he runs a small construction company. But his main source of income for him and his family is hunting and the guiding he does on these hunts in Africa. So back to Kenya. Kenya, prior to 1977, had pretty much your standard amount of wildlife in Africa. Is fairly populated with pretty much every African species. In 1977, the government decided that it would be a good idea to ban all types of hunting. This wasn't just banning white people coming in Africa and hunting, or the white landowners, but this also included the natives, white, black, whatever you were. You could not hunt anything for meat, for game. There could be no killing of wildlife at all. Most people would suspect that this would boost the wildlife numbers, but it has had the exact opposite effect. Wildlife numbers in Kenya have declined 60 to 70% since 1977. At the same time they banned hunting, they also started counting all the wildlife. That's how they have that number. This isn't just included in, or this does include all of Kenya, not just the hunting areas, but also includes the national parks, public, private land. All types of land are included in the survey, and that's so 60 to 70% of the animals declining. That's a huge number, and this also has big economic impact for the people there. Like Chris, that was his main source of income. That was his job. That was his livelihood. He had to leave Kenya and I guess move to Tanzania where he could continue with his profession. This also increased poaching because a lot of these people that's how they ate their food. That's where it came from, was killing wild game, eating it. But once that stopped, or once it became illegal, those people, rather than starve to death, decided it was worth the risk to poach, and thus poaching numbers have increased dramatically in Kenya since the ban on hunting. The ban on hunting has also, like I said, reduced wildlife to 60 to 70% less than prior to 1977. It's also estimated that within 10 to 20 years, the majority of large mammals in Kenya will either have migrated out or will be extinct. So we can see that banning hunting actually has the opposite effect on conservation of wildlife numbers, of even the human economic impact is a negative one. And then we look at countries such as Namibia and South Africa, two of the largest hunting countries in the African continent. South Africa in particular, since hunting has exploded in South Africa, the amount of land that's used for wildlife designated wildlife areas have more than doubled, the same in Namibia. South Africa is by far the largest hunting country in Africa, that brings in the most money and the most people. And it also has the most land available for hunting. And this equals the most animals. That's why people hunt there the most, is because there's more animals there, they're more readily available, and it's frankly easier to hunt there. And so, like I talked about earlier in my other speech, hunting is actually a major influence in animal conservation. And it's not the other way around. A lot of people think, oh, just stop hunting, more animals will survive. It just has a negative effect, because poaching numbers go up, and just all sorts of other influences affect them, and it just goes down. Another big thing that anti-hunters might say, or people that are against hunting will say, well, the photo safaris are just as good as a hunting safari. Well, surprisingly, those photo safaris contribute very little to wildlife conservation. There's not a whole lot of donations going to these from these companies to organizations that contribute to wildlife conservation. On the other hand, hunters are some of the biggest donators to the organizations, and play the biggest factor in wildlife conservation. So as we can see from examples of Kenya and South Africa and Namibia, mainly in Kenya, hunting and having hunters in your country will ultimately lead to more animals and more money and better lifestyle for humans and animals in general. Thanks.